Okay, so we're going to talk about how to prove triangles congruent, and we're going to start with the easiest way, which is to prove that all of their sides are congruent. So here, we're given that two different sides are congruent. That's given here that KL is congruent to NL, those segments. Those are marked with single tick marks. We're also given that KM is congruent to NM. Those are marked with double tick marks. So our next step, if we're going to prove these two triangles congruent, is to use the reflexive property to say, hey, this segment is equal to itself. So that's our third side being congruent. Remember, the reflexive property says that A equals A. I am myself. And so that's enough information right there. If the three sides are the same, then the two triangles are also congruent. And so that may seem pretty easy, but you don't always have all the information. And so sometimes you got to figure out how can I prove that these are congruent triangles. So let's look here. We're given that two segments are congruent, and we're also given that C is the midpoint of two other segments, okay? So first, here's segment AE. We know that C is the midpoint there. To prove in this case that these are congruent, you have to remember that a midpoint means I'm splitting a segment directly in half. So that means that these two segments are going to be congruent. And now this blue one, we're going to know that these segments are also congruent. And so that's enough information here. But let's talk about how we would construct a proof to show what we've just done. The first thing we're always going to do with a proof is to record our given, right? And so we were given quite a bit. That's recorded now, that our two segments we marked as congruent at the start, and then our midpoint. Our midpoint allowed us to mark the remaining segments as congruent, just because what a midpoint is, if you remember back to when we talked about what is a midpoint falls directly in the middle of a segment, and so it splits that segment into two congruent sections. So our reason for that would just be, if you remember back to proofs, hey, this is the definition of a midpoint. That's what a midpoint is. Once we have recorded that, that's going to show that all three sides of these triangles are congruent. And again, if remember, our topic today is side, side, side congruence. So once we know that all three sides are congruent, we've proven that these two triangles are congruent, and that would be our last statement. We're done.